Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is Carl speaking. You might know me as the Rasputin. And this is the making of for Evolution. Evolution is a track by these guys here that I created the music video for. And I'm gonna tell you a bit about how I did that. This is not going to be a tutorial because obviously you can't cover hundreds of work hours inside one single video. I'm going to show you work in progress material and things that didn't even make it into the final video. First of all, this is the very first time I'm doing a video like this, so this is very likely to get a little awkward in some places because of me screwing things up or things not working as expected. Nevertheless, I hope you will still enjoy it. If you have already watched the video, thank you. If you have not done so, please do watch the video by clicking on the link, because it was a lot of work and I'm gonna show you why. So, how do you get started with a big project like this? Well, you break it into smaller tasks and make sure you have a way to communicate ideas between you and the other guys. And in this case, that meant I came over to the house and drew the animatic on a Windows tablet. So we bounced a few ideas around and very quickly agreed that we wanted to have a kind of visual evolution as well. That means we wanted to get the visuals more and more sophisticated over the course of the whole video. Obviously you can see that in the animatic, because those are all crappy 2 to 3 minute sketches. We also thought that emulating different mediums was a nice thing to do, which is why you see a stone texture in here, so that in the following parts you would perhaps have a cloth or a paper look or something. And they wanted me to go for a minimalist look. Not sure if it was just for economical reasons, but it was a wise decision, as we are gonna see now. Okay, so here's the first thing I did. And this obviously wasn't going really minimalistic in terms of color, at least. I mean, the shapes are simple, but it's ugly. So I made another one, this one here. It had a really rough style, which was fitting for the scenery and the setting and everything. It was more the direction which we wanted to go for. The next thing I did was I created a little layout sheet. The idea which we all agreed upon was to make something like a prehistoric mural that is starting to move, that's going to animate. Basically the pictures are lining to move. Here's the cave in the beginning with the animals and this guy jumping into the gene pool, his sons walking through the forest. Mother Nature is a tree, my hands, and the clock transition. We even went so far as to go into the transitions. Then with the last shot, and then we had the refrain, which is another topic. And then it was time to collect some nice cave painting reference, because even drawing crappy cave paintings is something that you have to learn, unless you are a cave painter by education. So the next thing I did was animate the first scene. This was my first try at kind of going with a minimalist, rough style. It had this nice brushy line work here, but that didn't make it onto the final video, because it looked super crappy. And it was very tedious to animate, and it has all this noise and rough stuff going on that kind of detracts a bit from the action of the characters.
Zu einer Zeit, bevor es das Wort gab, als die größte Sünde der Mord war, blieb die Frau mit den Kindern sorgsam, als der Mann zum Überleben vortrat.
So I went for another style that you can see in the final video. That's more like it. Another little experiment was this one. Very easy to manage. You had basically the outlines and the colors, and then you added a little bit of noise and turbulence over the lines to make them look more rough and wavy. A little bit of noise here and there, and a nice little background. Yeah, so this is the background which I did using a little bit of brush strokes. This is actually tileable, so you can move the whole thing and it tiles all the way through. Very important for the animation. You don't want ugly seams to show up here and there. And all of these layers are tileable. You can take the whole thing and move it, and it will always work. There are no seams. Yay! Next thing I did was go into Flash again and make my first pass of foreground animation. So yeah, this was not done in Photoshop, simply because animation is way easier to manage inside Flash. It's vector based, which means I can zoom in insane amounts. And yeah, it's generally very resource friendly. And at the end of that, I put it inside After Effects. This is all just basic Flash animation, I guess. I also animated entire parts inside Photoshop. Was a bit easier to play with these masks and get these brushy cave painting thingies in there. I then went ahead and imported them into After Effects. You don't see these hands in the final video. They were used as masks for the underlying parts. These were the animated bits from before, the Flash animation. What you see here is a bit of texture work to make it look more analog. Then I put the whole thing together with the background and moved it. Well, now that I'm looking at it, I think I could have done it in 2D as well, but I just wanted to have the additional freedom in case if I wanted to tilt the camera afterwards. Yeah, so these are all 3D planes inside After Effects. This one here is actually another part that I animated inside Photoshop to test out the workflow. Actually, it stayed quite true to the concept, I think. Nice. And also because of the parallax effect in the background. There's a little bit of parallax here, and I found it easier to have like Photoshop 3D layers and offset them inside After Effects space than to do it all inside Flash and hope to have it line up later on. Another reason why I did this inside Photoshop. And yeah, my favorite part. So you might have seen some of my more traditional 2D animation work in the past. And actually, I don't like doing 2D animation on a frame-by-frame basis at all. It just took me way too long to find that out. Because, you know, the thing is, sometimes you don't know if things aren't fun to you just because you lack the skills, you can do it properly, or simply because they aren't fun to you. Everybody has this special thing that resonates with them, and this is not what does it for me. So please don't ask me about it. But how did I do that? Well, there are some nice little actions that I made myself to make things easier. So if I want a new frame, I just hit F2 and it creates a new frame. Sometimes it doesn't work, but most of the time it's a little time saver. Grigg made a nice tutorial about his animation techniques inside Photoshop. I'm going to put these inside the description with all the other awesome tutorials. So yeah, first thing you do is rough animation. That part is actually quite fun. Then do the cleanup on top of that. The layers for the colors and the line art, they were originally, I think, separated, but they ended up putting them together just to be able to mesh things up a little bit more. It's a mural painting after all, not an anime. I did have plans to do like a nice little flip book animation between the first verse and the refrain. So yeah, that didn't make it into the final video. Wasn't fitting so well with the style of the refrain. The effect itself is procedural. It's based on a time warp applied over a page turn transition. So basically the page turn happens one time every frame, and then you slow the whole thing down and get these nice flips here. But there is this guy, which you may know, Andrew Kramer, which made a nice tutorial about it and can explain it much better than me. Now we come to the first breakup in the style, the first real breakup, which is the refrain, the next step of evolution. I had a fair bit of trying stuff out here, different color schemes, rim lighting, completely different style. I didn't end up using this style for the final refrain. What I did do is use the background. I like the background. And, ooh, naked dude. Also the vignette. I did end up using those. The background does not tile because it doesn't move. so no one notices it. Yeah. Before I arrived at the final design, I informed myself a bit with some reference of Simon, the man behind the lyrics, from all the angles. This is what I arrived at. I hope you can see some resemblance here, but the big change here is we don't have any lines. It's kind of like breaking free from the boundaries and going into full-on shapes with a little bit of brushwork still, but not so rough as in the cave paintings you saw before. I started building the background with all the assets. I did these on separate layers so that I could just take them and replicate them wherever I wanted them. Same thing I did for the animals. I cut the animals into their different moving parts. That sounds brutal. So that I could move them later on. Kind of a little bit like cutout animation, but we'll go into more detail with that later on. Then I assembled them just to see how it looked. This isn't final, just a test. And I did the same thing for the character too. I made him into all these little parts. Don't worry, there's no nudity involved in this. Made him into all these little different parts that was going to move, so that I could rotate it later on. Here's a proof of concept for the first character you saw. It is simple, but kind of works, except his pants. Looks like some weird spring, kind of got caught up in there. But yeah, it works and it looks fluid. So the principle behind the animation is using the puppet tool and placing the pins among the different parts and then moving them. Yeah! That's not all. That's the first step, dividing it into different parts and sticking puppet pins to it. But this is not how I animated the whole thing. I did end up using some inverse kinematics to move them, so that I didn't have to rotate every single joint in there. Yeah, this isn't only for 3D artists. After Effects people can do it too. And this guy explains how. His tutorials are a phenomenal help. And he also puts up source files and all the things, work in progress material. It's really, really good. Check out his tutorials. So yeah, I'm gonna point to this plugin here as well. It's the base for quick inverse kinematics animation. It takes all the expression scripting hassle out of it and adds some really nice tools on top of that. So yeah, do check that out as well. The same type of puppet pin business was used for the face as well. As you can see, we have all these nice little pins, and if we move them, something happens. If you move them too much, it breaks. But fair enough, we can use this for our animation. And it's very neat because we don't have to redraw the face every time. But now you're gonna ask, that head, it moves and rotates and shifts in perspective. It looks like real 3D. This can't be done inside After Effects, can it? Well, yes, it actually can. With a nice little plugin named Freeform Pro. I tried out both of them, but Freeform was running a little bit faster for me, at least. I'm not gonna go into too much detail about that, because there is a nice set of tutorials made by Dave Legion, who goes into detail about his animated character Hope, and does a damn well job explaining it, I think. Yeah. So, I sculpted a 3D version of Simon, and based on that, I created a depth map, which I imported into After Effects, and with some further tweaking with masks and all that shit, used for displacement. All the 3D stuff is based on this depth map. You can, for example, expand it even more or make him all flat. But that's not all. It's a shitload of layers and fixing stuff and everything. Yeah. To be honest, I would have done this in a 3D application like Maya or something, but the 3D skills there were not sufficient at that point. What is also rather unfortunate is that the real-time feedback is slow. I mean, this is all just flat shading, nothing special going on here. And bearing that in mind, it actually takes quite long to render. But if you can make this technique work for you as well as he does, well, go for it. It can look really nice, I think. What I ended up doing for the lip sync is I used the keyframe assistant inside After Effects that can convert the audio into keyframes. And the guys were so kind as to give me a vocal-only version.
Von Generation zu Generation im Überlebenskampf zählt jede Aktion.
These values were then directly connected to the whole rig. Yeah. Together with all the other controllers you see here, I put them into a nice little rig, which is explained in these tutorials as well, so that I could conveniently adjust all his facial expressions, make him suffer extreme pain. I wish I could show you these in a better preview, but the computer, it's not fast enough. Here's a little breakdown of how the background assets are composed. I'll go into a bit more detail about these DNA strands, because these were done inside an external application, Cinema 4D to be precise. Again, I apologize, I don't have any time lapses or so recorded, but I'm gonna show you how I did these. So, the strands are all made up of some sweep NURBS, 2 of them, and as you may see, they have this nice little offset that Simon notified me about. DNA strands, they actually do have this offset. I had to think about that when I added like all these bases in there. I had to find a curve which accommodates for that, this one in the middle, so that they would all fit nicely in there with the rotation. So I did like a MoGraph effector which sets them off into space before they fly in. And you see it's a little bit dull and linear, of course, so I had to add like a shader to bring some noise into there, very little noise. And of course the random effector, along with some delay to breathe a bit more life into it. I'm gonna exaggerate this for you to see. Finally, I had to add another effector because they were flying a bit low actually. This is because the Earth, the planet, is moving around. So I had to push them up a little bit more so that they don't go too low. So, with all the assets nicely aligned in there, all I had to do was offset them in distance a little bit. I did this by creating some easy expressions. You see, all these expressions do is take the rotation of the null object and divide it so that everything in the background moves a bit slower than the things in the foreground, so that I could create a nice sense of perspective. With all that out of the way, I was able to create a character. Did this the same way I showed you before. That is by using a combination of the puppet tools together with the IK chains to control all his limbs and make him move nicely, and with motion blur and all the fancy things. His head is simply a video file imported from the other composition I showed you earlier, all to save rendering time. So for now, this shall be it for the refrain. Moving on, we have the second verse, which I did some composition thumbnails for. Obviously, with our next stage of evolution, we are moving into the realm of perspective, and me as a 3D guy, I love playing with all these crazy frog perspective and kind of wide angle-ish shots, with some little shenanigans here and there, as you can see. And yeah, all inspired and driven by our animatic. Similarly to the refrain, I've built all of these into single layers and assets with everything that was gonna move. Our Simon character has a lot of rotation going on, so I was able to do that by manipulating it right here inside After Effects with a lot of rotation and skewing here and there, and of course the puppet tool. By the way, his spear is a 3D layer. Yay! Now this shot actually has some funny stuff going on here. I introduced a bit of perspective distortion by using a 3D camera projection technique inside After Effects. You see? All the stuff is broken up into different parts. This is the way I painted the texture with a huge border. I didn't want all of this to get distorted and so on. So I set up a layer beneath it, which was distorted in space, and projected the image onto it using a light. This is a technique described in one of Andrew Kramer's tutorials. I don't know if it's exactly this one. Don't blame me if you learn the wrong stuff. Haha. Yeah, really useful technique. This very shot here had a lot of perspective going on, and I drew all these keyframes of our character, used a perspective grid for reference, and then again proceeded onto doing all these colored versions of our character, again with his parts moving here. Okay, so now this is where it gets really funny. Yes, this is true. This is the very part where I painted a 3D texture inside Photoshop and distorted it in space to give this character a 3D feel. I should have escaped onto 3D land by then. But I kept on pushing it through and actually made it happen without any major fallouts in the character model. This is his torso, twisting in fake 3D space mapped onto his other body parts. And this is all little fiddling work. I want just not to break the character model. Very risky and very complicated stuff, I'd say, just to give it that fluid feel and all that. So here is a more two-dimensional shot in terms of perspective, at least. And with all of this different stuff going on in each of these shots, I wasn't really able to reuse any of these assets except for his head, for example, and all the colors which I was able to sample. But apart from that, everything was kind of rebuilt every single time. A really smart thing would have been to flatten the animation in terms of perspective, and also to build reusable complete character rigs like he did. But stupid me, I didn't want to go without all the freedom and exploration inside the realms of perspective. I'm a 3D guy after all, so I ended up rebuilding all these things as you see them here. I'm showing you these as quick little breakdowns, as the process remained the same for most of them. The trees in this shot were copied over from another shot. Moving on though, we have my favorite shot of all of them, this one. As you can see in the final product, we had lots of perspective going on. And it was done using the exact same process. Sketching everything out, all the individual keyframes, yeah, get the idea. And then drawing all the individual body parts, fitting them in from 8 different perspectives and aligning them in space, along with fake wraparound textures for his body parts, and lots, and I mean lots of fiddling around and adjusting things and fixing here and there. So yeah, this was pretty much a little nightmare. A normal animator would have drawn this in 2D in frame by frame instead, or any sane person actually. I did not, mostly because I kind of got obsessed with 3D and all the technical parts at a very young age, and it spoiled me a bit. So as you can imagine, I get bored rather quickly from drawing the same characters over and over and over again 12 times a second or something. On top of that, the initial head animation looked like this. So the rig being not real 3D, it broke from a lot of angles, and I ended up fixing this frame by frame. by painting over it. This is all the wavy stuff you see here. Yes. But now we get to the fun part. It is 3D! Yes. Pretty much all of the stuff until now kind of surpassed the expectations. So yeah, they really trusted me on this one and I thank them for that. But I mean, it fits. We have evolution and we have cave paintings, 2D hybrid animation and then 3D. I mean, come on, it makes sense. But before going all nuts inside ZBrush, I did some concepting first, did some drawings. I wanted to retain some of the color scheme. You see the reds and the grayish blues. Tried out some variants with that. Did some traditional ones also, trying out perspective. And yeah, then I jumped right into ZBrush and started building this guy. This is a quick rundown of what I did. So, saw the head already. I made the hair with extract and dynamesh with a bit of retopology, and I sculpted the body. I used a base mesh as well. This guy actually. Yeah, I reused his eyes, as you can see. Those are some really nice eyes. So the body has some polygroups on it. Looks like a sports jacket here, but actually I used it to extract the shirt from it. And yeah, with a bit of sculpting, got into this shape. This is our initial block out face for the suitcase. So this is what we are at. And this is what I ended up with at the end of that. He's got some nice shoes. Made these with panel loops and some curved tubes for the strings. His pants got some more detail. Nice seams. His tie is a dynamesh. And yeah, that's it. So, the high poly sculpt was finished. I booted up the Decimation Master. And this enabled me to get down the poly count to a tolerable degree for Maya, so that I could do the retopology in there. And this is what the Decimation Master gave me. Bing! As you can see, it is still quite dense, but Maya's Viewport 2.0 runs it quite smoothly. Topology was done using the Quad Draw tool. This is what I ended up with after that. Some nice clean animation topology. And ran some shading tests with it. And there he is, with the Toon shader applied. I used the ramp shader to mimic the look we had in the second verse and inside the refrain. And I went a step further. You can see he looks very clean with his shapes. He also has his suitcase, which I forgot to show you earlier. And there's nothing in there. But I ended up discarding all of that and went for a more simple look. This one. Now you might actually be wondering, why'd you do that, Carl? He looked so nice and smooth and you went for the low poly look, you fucking hipster. Well, this is all nice and dandy, but he would have needed some really high poly blend shapes and a better rig and a better facial expressions. And of course the environment would have had to live up to that amount of detail as well. And obviously this wasn't at all going with the minimalist approach anymore. I mean, I had been deviating from it quite a bit, but this was way too much. So I sat down at the drawing pad and made some nice blocky versions and started building shapes inside of Maya. And after a decent amount of time, there was a low poly version of him. Initially with eyebrows. Next version even had some real eyes. But this was too much, so I went back to the look you were already familiar with. This is nice, you can see how I just built it around this old mesh and went for a completely different thing. And with a decent amount of reference and thinking in boxes, I ended up with a low poly version. I was aiming for a paper look on this one, so I did some rendering tests, first without and then with color added. And these were metal ray materials with actual translucency, which I discarded later on in favor of shorter rendering times. Now, the rig was really simple. This character didn't really ask for a very complicated setup. Maya already has a nice set of tools built in, named HumanIK. So I rigged him with HumanIK, just built the additional stuff on top of that, like a type physics. And I'm just going through all of these files to show you the evolution of the whole thing. That's him with controllers added. And as I discovered later on, most people actually seem to be using HumanIK mostly for retargeting mocap data onto your model's rig. So I made this fun little test animation to see how it would work. In this file, I had added all the facial blend shapes for his expressions. And yes, there is a really nice book by Jason Osipa called Stop Staring, which helped me a lot with these blend shapes. And I ended up liking his book so much that I stole his facial rig and used it for my character. Which is really cool because you can do real lip sync with that. And he has this nice set of Maya scripts and project files which you can set onto a shelf. And this helps a lot with generating symmetrical shapes or splitting them up into different sides. There is actually a plugin that does this and more stuff called Shapes 2.0, I think. Finally, I added his suitcase back in and made it move with his arm. And that's it for the character. This is a basic plugin of his walk cycle. And of course, this wasn't all done by ear. There were some calculations involved. So I took the track, analyzed it, and came up with this, which means a complete walk cycle should take about 66.6 frames, and one beat in the music takes 16.6 frames. Moving on, I added a little street in there. This is actually the street moving, not the character, just to make things a bit more easier on my brain. And HumanIK is actually not so much recommended for keyframed animation, as it creates keyframes for the controllers and it creates keyframes for each of the FK skeleton joints as well. But you can map any of these controls to a custom rig too, which I didn't do. Moving on, I began blocking in the jumping animation with the suitcase flying in. Right here I've been exploring the different camera angles with the help of the camera sequencer. And his tie still stays in place because I saved the physics simulation for later. Okay, so here's what we had in mind for the environment. We knew we wanted to show the character from the back walking into this skyline. That way we could play off the big shapes of these powerful buildings against him. Also on the left and right side I would need some objects in the foreground to set the background off a bit better. So I went on and started it with some cubes. This looks a bit funny. It's the animation converted into bounding boxes for better performance and because it looks funny, yeah. I built some blocks, set them off in space so I could see if this was gonna work out or not. So performance was quite well, so I brought in another cache file and a lantern, just for fun. Next file. So until this, it was all mostly just blocks, like this one, and that one. And now I started building things into them. Just basic modeling techniques, extruding and beveling everything to get a bit more variation into that. Moving on, I adjusted the scale and set them off in space, added some more details. And what's important to note about all this is that cameras have a clipping plane. So by default it's like, I don't know, 10,000 or even 5,000 or so. So you won't see much if you use the editor's camera. It's all flickering and nasty. So what you need to do is obviously adjust the clipping plane and also bump up the near clip plane to get rid of all these glitches and have some nice blue skyscrapers. Next item on the list is an electricity pole. The pole itself is just basic modeling, and the cord is a spline with a circle extruded along it. And because the cords were Bezier splines, I could use Maya hair physics to do a basic physics simulation. I baked the physics simulation into a cache file and then just duplicated it onto all the other electricity cords to save performance. Another item that needed to be added was the sign on the right here. The sign was added for the sake of balance. Because I had all these wires and poles on the left side, I needed something on the right. Otherwise it would just have been empty space and not very pleasant to look at. So at this point I'm pretty much finished with all our basic skyscraper meshes, and I began experimenting with deformers because they needed to bounce to the music. I ended up using a squash deformer for that. And using the same measuring technique as described before with our little character, I animated them by hand.
Von Generation zu Generation im Überlebenskampf zählt jede Aktion nach.
The only thing necessary after that was to add a bit more density to everything to fill up the gaps. That means copy and paste or duplicate. And with that out of the way, I added the environment back into our nice little character animation. So obviously this did take a huge hit on the performance, and there was still some additional lip syncing which had to be done. So this is the frame rate without the city, and this is everything with the background on. So what you do is hide everything that you don't need. Take a nice little camera with the facial controls in there and begin lip syncing everything until it fits.
Evolution, bitch, das ist Evolution, Evolution.
And as we're beginning to wrap up on the Maya side of things, we come to every computer's favorite part of 3D animation, which is the rendering. I've split this up into two passes, I think. One is the environment, the other one is the path and the character. This way I had more control over the depth of field effect, which I added later on, and it also made things easier if I, for example, would have had to re-render just the character, but not the insane amount of skyscrapers in the back. Last but not least, there were some render passes for ambient occlusion, and obviously a depth pass for depth of field. A quick little tip about the depth pass. If you add a depth pass for the first time, you will most likely get only a black picture or something. What a lot of people, including me, had to find out first is that to fix it, you will have to enable remap depth values. And then here, enter the value of your back object that you want to blur or not to blur and be included in the whole pass. So, for example, this number is based on the skyscrapers at the very back of the scene. Also, the files were being rendered at floating point data. So if you, for example, were going for 8-bit, you might also have to change the buffer value, but I'm not so sure about that. You better double check that. The rendering was kind of crazy. I have a single machine, a single workstation. Metal Ray obviously isn't not GPU based, so it took like 50 hours. And then at night, my workstation would heat up the whole room and stuff. Yeah. But okay, so here we have our transition. You see, same story, single parts and stuff. These are some gradient masks that I used for transitions inside After Effects. You can see in the background, we have these swoosh going on from the traditional to the 3D version. That's what I used the gradient masks for. But there are some more masks going on inside here. If you look at our arm, it is dissolving right before our very eyes. This is where it is. This is our drop code form layer. And what I did do is I used the transition layer for displacing the arm, which looks like this. Just a bunch of pixelated noise going on. And all these colors, they displace each individual pixel in space. So the more contrast I have going on, the more displacement there is. Of course, you can bump up the strength as well. But yeah, so that was just a matter of placing that in there. Have the original one fading out and the other one fading in. And of course, our 3D arm needed to have a fade in animation as well, which I did using the same technique, of course. The second shot has another thing going on. Here the displacement is also controlled by the depth, which means the back is more displaced than the front. Here is the transition mask for that. As you can see, I masked out the arm using the depth mask. And yeah, just added a bit of pixelation on top of it, which did not hurt the look at all. So this actually wraps things up mostly on the talking end. I'm just gonna give you 2 more breakdowns I made and then we're done. If you've actually watched all of this, well, thank you so much. And thank you also to all the people out there who helped me with this stuff, with all their tutorials and resources. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, and if you don't like it, give it a thumbs down and send me evil hate mail. Also, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask, whether it's about some technical details or stuff in general. And now I'm gonna shut up and let the rest of the video play. Bye.
Generation zu Generation im Überlebenskampf zählt jede Aktion. Natürliche Selektion entlässt das entlegene Ion. Bitch, das ist Evolution. Bitch, das ist Evolution. Bitch, das ist Evolution. Evolution, Evolution. Von Generation zu Generation im Überlebenskampf zählt jede Aktion. Natürliche Selektion entlässt das entlegene Ion. Bitch, das ist Evolution. Bitch, das ist Evolution. Bitch, das ist Evolution. Evolution, Evolution.
Animated certain parts inside Photoshop. What the hell is that? Nice shoes. Here's some goddamn shoes! If you have watched the video